Logan, we are recording this late at night, the Wednesday before the Thursday that this is released. I haven't had dinner yet. I'm kind of hungry.
Really?
Yeah, but I don't know what I want. Like, I want something that's kind of a little like salty. But I don't want it to be all salt. You kind of want that balance, between the kind of the sweet, kind of sugary, that natural sugariness, and you want some protein in there. But I don't really think I have anything like that.
You're looking for one meal that includes all those things.
Yeah, that's like just nice and hearty, but isn't like a lot of I've come kind of a small statured guy. Yeah. So I can't consume that much. So I got to get a lot of bang for my buck for the stuff that I'm consuming.
Get a lot of energy out of a small substance. Really.
Yeah, exactly. But
I have something for you. Actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
This is not an ad. This is not our ad.
Are you around any buffalo currently?
Buffalo. I think there's a reserve in Minnesota where they do conservation and research, but I don't like where this is going.
Well, have you ever heard of pemmican?
Pemmican?
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say pemmican. I meant to say come again.
Uh-huh. I found out about this recently, Sam, and I've been trying it, and it's like coffee on steroids. It's like coffee and steroids. It's all from buffalo fat mixed in with buffalo fat and meat mixed in with, you can toss in blueberries in there. You mash it up, you dry it out in the sun in the plains, and it's so people have different feelings on whether it tastes good, but everyone agrees that it's going to satisfy that urge.
Yeah.
That you're describing.
And it sounds like it could be made from things, around me in Minnesota, plants and animals that are native to Minnesota, you could really sustain yourself off of.
Yeah.
Is what that sounds like.
It's certainly, listen, you're picking up exactly what I'm putting down. Yeah.
Yeah, which is a big puck of pemmican. Logan.
It sure is.
Tell me, where did you hear about this new superfood?
I heard about it in Chapter 7 of Mary Lethert Wingerd's North Country, a really exceptional book about Minnesota history.
Wow.
That you and I have actually been, it might sound familiar because you and I have been reading through it for the last few months.
That does ring a bell now that you put it like that. No, in fact, it sounds like it was an essential food source for the indigenous people and the traders that obviously relied on indigenous methods of surviving in the North Country. What a wonderful book, but I'm glad that we're talking about this now because, sometimes it's hard to retain all of that information from this phenomenal text. So why don't we just kind of recap the rest of Chapter 7 to get into this?
Oh, yeah. Oh, since we brought up the pemmican, since we're talking about the pemmican.
Yeah.
Well, sure. Well, it's good that you mentioned the importance of pemmican to both the indigenous peoples here and the traders and settlers, because that relationship has been obviously at the forefront of this book so far, and it's going to remain that way for this.
Well, I imagine it'd be pretty tough if you wanted to get your hands on any bison pemmican today. I mean, population of bison in Minnesota are dwindling. And largely on reserves like the one that I mentioned in Minnesota, which, by the way, I need to legally say I am not planning on harvesting pemmican from. I might get my master naturalist license revoked if I eat a bison.
That might do it. Yeah.
Anyway, that's my transition to talk about the scarcity that the indigenous people were dealing with in the 1840s. Logan, why don't you tell me a little bit about that? What's the population like for the indigenous folks in 1840s? Last week we talked a little bit, or last podcast we talked a little bit about kind of the treaties where people are starting to be pushed off and what kind of the changing indigenous Minnesota North Country relationship culture was like. So what does this mean for the survival of the indigenous folks here in Minnesota?
Well, you're right. There's high demand for buffalo hide in the 1840s.
High demand. High demand. Hide.
Yes,
demand.
I see.
There's high demand for the hide demand.
Bison, however, had disappeared, as Wingerd writes, they disappeared east of the Mississippi. In 1832, the last buffalo was seen east of that, the Great Mighty River. But there was still a substantial population out west. But that population moved further west each year. And the demands of the trade required overhunting, essentially. And that it already was decades in the making on plenty of other resources in Minnesota by the 1830s and 40s. And when that demand for capital to be traded found its way to the bison as well, it began to do that to them too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've got good news for the buffalo of the 1830s and 40s, and that is that high demand is not going to be met. The high demand for their hides, man, are not going to be met by the American Fur Company any longer, because they are kaput. They are dust. They are crushed. They are demolished. They are dead. They are dead. In fact, one of the rivals of the Fur Company wrote that they had exploded, quote, disappeared, overwhelmed with the most miserable bankruptcy. They have met their just desert, end quote. And I think
not pemmican.
Yeah, not pemmican. You would need some sort of sugar, maybe like a topping of maple sugar, kind of get that. Oh, that actually sounds quite disgusting. I'm imagining like beef jerky with maple sugar, with maple syrup on it.
That's not the right kind of dessert that these guys got. Yeah.
But so that would not be just dessert, but they got their just dessert. So the Great American Fur Company is dead. A lot of fur traders are either independent traders or working with other companies, but mostly they're moving on to, Logan, there's such a thing called speculation and
that's right.
Land purchasing, including, and I quote Wingerd on page 152, quote, shrewd entrepreneurs like Dowsman, Brown, and Henry Sibley were busily investing in steamboats, timber, sawmills, and land, both as individuals and on behalf of companies that employed them, end quote. So there we heard Hercules Dowsman, Joseph Brown, and Henry Sibley, some of the big players in early Minnesota, though we're not quite Minnesota yet. That name for the land is on the horizon. We'll get to that today. That's a little bit of sizzle for you big Minnesota fans out there.
That's right, and hopefully there are some listening to this
name podcast. Minnesota, because we've been the name, I guess. If you're big on names,
yeah. Well, no, that's a great point. At this point in time, the land that we're talking about is actually part of Wisconsin territory.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's right.
I can taste the pemmican coming back up.
But there was a sense. There was a distinct sense among the people living in what is now Minnesota that they were separate from Wisconsin. They were more closely intertwined with the Dakota trade, the specific Dakota trade happening around the Mississippi River Valley. And there was a different culture made out of the specific hybrid voyageur and Dakota Ojibwe society that had been built in the past few centuries.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but around 1842 there was a big a land cession. Am I understanding this correctly? With the Ojibways, and they were dealing with that to get a little bit more wealth, because people like the shrewd entrepreneurs like we heard about previously, they're already in the land even if they don't have a right to it. They're already collecting the timber even if they don't have a right to it. And one of the Ojibwe chiefs here that Wingerd quotes on page 153, Wabajeshi, he was the head chief for his band in the north central Wisconsin area, and they signed a treaty saying that they would get some compensation for the extraction that was taking place largely with the timber. He said, quote, "It was no mistake that we should remain on the land as long as we are peaceable. We have no objections to the white man's working the mines and the timber and making farms, but we reserve the birch bark and cedar for the canoes, the rice and the sugar tree, and the privilege of hunting without being disturbed by the whites," end quote. But not everyone was as is on board with that, as optimistic on the promise of the treaty. Wingerd writes, another chief who remained unconvinced considered the treaty, quote, a lying, cheating concern, the whole of it, end quote. So as we get into the 1840s, we spend a lot of time talking about sort of central and southern Minnesota. Largely, you and I grew up in southern Minnesota, and the capital is in kind of south central area. Obviously, the northern regions in the Ojibwe land is just as much part of that. And often the Ojibwe treaties were sort of the dry runs. They were the testing ground for more of the southern land that is more tenable for farming, or had better access for the trade networks on the river trade. So that was a huge development in 1842. That's
right. And this massive land cession reflects, as Wingerd puts it on page 155, that, quote, by the 1840s, powerful economic and government interests were making their influence felt in myriad ways that affected the economic condition and social relations of everyone who lived in Minnesota country. White men could either wholeheartedly get on the bandwagon of progress or suffer the consequences of clinging to an outmoded way of life. Indians could only strategize to hold off the usurpation of their homelands as long as possible. Increasingly, especially with the fall of the American Fur Company and the splintering of its employees and contractors into this wide variety of businesses and treaty-making opportunities, what's on the horizon is pretty clear. And it's that the influx of cash from treaty annuities, the government sending money to Indian bands and tribes on behalf for land, is the most substantial flow of money coming into the territory, and it has to be taken advantage of in some way.
That's right. Like we said previously, the fur trade has gone from being called the fur trade to the Indian trade. The commodity that you are buying and selling, the market good that you are providing and managing, is the Native American who is receiving, at least in theory, some amount of annuity payment that can then be sort of a cash flow into your territory, into your companies, into your communities. Whether or not that reflected itself socially in the value that the Native Americans had in the North Country, it didn't reflect. It was just economic. I don't want to bury the lead there. So let's talk about how is all this happening, and I think that Wingerd sums it up in also on 155, actually, just after what you just read. Quote, the American ideology of free market capitalism fueled the ambitious plans of individuals to acquire and remake Minnesota country, but none of the schemes could have succeeded without the power of the government at its side. A legal infrastructure enforced by civil and military authority was necessary to legitimate claims and protect investments. In Indian country, boundaries had always been somewhat inexact, unless marked by the course of a river. As long as private ownership of land was not an issue, precise demarcation had been an unnecessary nicety. With the first land cession, back in 1837, however, this abruptly changed. As men scrambled to acquire their individual pieces of what had become acreage and real estate, boundary lines became the stuff of legal disputes, fisticuffs, and even an occasional murder. Terms like preemption and proving up, which meant making some visible mark of ownership on the property, soon became part of the lexicon of daily conversation. Claimants hustled to the federal land office at Prairie du Chien and later St. Croix Falls, where they legally recorded ownership of their little piece of Minnesota country, end quote.
This is where we walk into the story of a guy named Pig Eye. As the boundary lines are being drawn across Minnesota and land becomes something that can be specifically owned by you in your own plot and developed by you and profited off of, with this legal backing, with this military backing. Joseph Plimpton, the commandant at Fort Snelling, sees an opportunity. He and a couple other officials at Fort Snelling are invested in the land, in land speculation. And he is realizing that the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers, which Fort Snelling is on, provides a great opportunity for future trade, should the area that is currently today Minnesota become, its own state, and trade be opened up to the region. So he sends word up to his advisors and the people in charge that it is a military necessity that more and more of the land around Fort Snelling be under military control, and thus military potential profiting. So all of the settlers living around Fort Snelling, not a large community necessarily, but certainly within the scant white population of Minnesota at the time, one of the larger I think the largest community has grown up around Fort Snelling. They have to get pushed off in order to satisfy Plimpton's plans for this eating up of the land around Fort Snelling. Mm-hmm. So he goes out, sends the word, the government makes it official over the protests of the white settlers living around Fort Snelling.
Right.
And they're kicked out. First they go across the banks of the Mississippi, then Plimpton buys that land too, and now all of a sudden they have to go downriver.
Oh.
And that is where a young man, is he a young man? His age doesn't really matter. Very, very little
Very little about this man
I hesitate to say this about a human being.
Except for his eye.
Other than his eye, apparently. And if you see a picture of this guy, who I guess we haven't said anything about yet, his name does make sense. Pierre Parrant.
He does not have an age of death, or a year of death. It is unclear when he died. There's a 14-year period between 1872 and 1886 when he might have died.
Yeah, it's awesome. I mean, so this mysterious man we're talking about is Pierre Parrant, sometimes known as Pig's Eye, a voyager turned whiskey trader who was the first person to take fullest advantage of.
He was around 40 or 50.
In the wake of the. In the wake of the evictions, of the military evictions, he heads up to a spot, the first spot that could potentially be a port upriver, a place that becomes known as Pig's Eye, because he has set up a whiskey shop there.
Right. And he wasn't alone. A lot of the people that Plimpton forced off were whiskey traders, whiskey peddlers, and otherwise undesirable figures in Plimpton's eye, but nonetheless they garnered a lot of wealth, and they garnered a lot of trades, or a lot of sales, and there was a large flow of cash to basically wherever the alcohol went. And Pierre Parrant, Pig's Eye, good old Pig's Eye, a Pig's Eye. He was a big whiskey seller, and other people cropped up around him, and basically no matter how far Plimpton pushed him, people continued to follow Parrant, and there are repercussions for that we'll get into.
Yeah, we should say today, the day that we're recording this, June 2nd, is Pig's Eye Day. The day that he set up camp on Pig's Eye.
Well,
so happy Pig's Eye Day to everyone who's listening to this.
Actually,
on June 2nd.
Apparently, there's a chance that Pierre Parrant is listening to this because
that's right.
For all we know, he's still kicking, still being pushed down, chasing a liquor license, or probably avoiding a liquor license is what it sounds like.
That's right. So let's talk a little bit about what this village is like. There's a great quote from Wingerd on page 161 about who these people are now that they've been pushed out to Pig's Eye. Most, she says, had no desire to store up more wealth than they needed to sustain their current lifestyle. Nor were they interested in setting up businesses or claiming vast tracts of land for resale. They valued instead a community shaped by mutual support and conviviality. The freaks.
Community. Support.
The idiots.
Collective good.
Yeah.
Reliance on your fellow human being. What? Oh, come again? Can't be serious. All right.
Pemmican, it's called.
Oh, sorry.
They set up... So they set up what's honestly a very nice little community, despite its foundation on illegal whiskey trading, purchasing, and mass drinking.
Pork organs.
And pork organs, apparently. That's right.
Yeah.
But some people realize that there's a different future in store.
Oh.
Henry Rice Henry Sibley, and our team of speculators and elites who had previously been imagining a future around Fort Snelling had a little bit of a hiccup in their plans with Plimpton's goals. But the creation of Pig's Eye means that, as Wingerd calls it, a land developer's gold mine has been born, and they start to invest in the area.
And because of this huge push to get these whiskey sellers, these hooligans, out of official government territory, that also sort of pushes these sellers from beyond the protection and the oversight of the law, basically they can make their own rules. They can make their own trade. It's a little more like bartering than it is anything like cash, sort of like what the furs once were.
Yeah.
Now that has basically become barrels of whiskey. I want to tell you the story about a fellow named Donald McDonald. Mostly because of his name, yes. But allegedly he gave up his well-located claim of land for a, quote, barrel of whiskey and 2 Indian guns, end quote. In fact, Wingerd writes, land claims became a sort of quasi-currency, traded, gambled, or even given away from one hand to another with bewildering rapidity. With thousands of miles available for the taking, whiskey was a far more valuable commodity. A gallon sold for as much as $80. Land claims were commonly traded for a horse, a wagon, a gallon of whiskey, or a gun, or to settle gambling debts of $10 or $20. So that is where the people actually living in the North Country actually value the land, because they are more focused on their day-to-day survival and sounds like their enjoyment of life.
That's right.
But
that
doesn't last.
There's some investment opportunities. That's right. And more people start coming to this small spot, including priests. One priest, for sure, Lucien Galtier, which builds up a little bit of a fiercely religious community in this little settlement. And the religious folk coming into Pig's Eye are not thrilled about its reputation or its name. A man named Benjamin Gervais donates land to the church, upon which they build a chapel, the Chapel of St. Paul, above Pig's Eye. And the priest I mentioned, Father Lucien Galtier, proposes that maybe instead of naming it after the potentially immortal, ugly whiskey seller, we name our little town after this chapel on the hill up there. And the town agrees. And St. Paul is born.
Right, and it became a hub, became a boom town. Like you said, it sort of overtook Mendota and the Fort Snelling area as the main trade center. So all of the plans that folks like Plimpton, folks like Sibley had for Minnesota kind of went out the window and had to be oriented a little bit to focus more on the Pig's Eye, or St. Paul now. And you remember our old friend Franklin Steele? Franklin Steele?
Yeah, I sure do.
He's the timber guy, but turns out he actually hasn't had too much actual timber. Quote, Steele was unable to get his sawmill up and running until 1847, but even had he produced a supply of lumber, there was no way to get it markets downriver or even to St. Paul, where builders laboriously hewed planks by hand to house a growing trickle of new residents. As an unintended consequence of government intervention, Mendota, located ideally where the St. Peter River joined the Mississippi and St. Anthony, with its invaluable water power waiting to be tapped, were blocked from development, while St. Paul was fast becoming the premier destination for new investors in Minnesota country. So slight pause on Franklin Steele's plan, because St. Paul is where it's at. But how does this?
So
So we're in a state of transition here.
Yeah. Just to recap that point there, just takeaway for the viewers at home is Major Plimpton's plan to take advantage of the lucrative spot around Fort Snelling instead creates St. Paul, which then immediately becomes the most important spot on that southern Mississippi River.
Let's talk a little further up north, even farther from the Mendota-Fort Snelling area. Let's go all the way to the border between Minnesota and Canada. There, you'll remember, we have a community of traders that basically cross at will, following the best deal they can find. So usually that means Canadian fur traders are coming down to the North Country, to the United States, and selling their furs there because they will make a better profit than they will with the British monopoly that is in Canada. And some people wanted to take advantage of that. And can you guess who that would be, Logan Ledman? Who in the North Country would want to take advantage of a potential business opportunity?
Sounds like Henry Sibley to me.
Sounds like well, you'd be right. And it's Henry Sibley, but there's a twist. There's a twist. He isn't going to do himself. He's not going to dirty his hands himself. He sends a fella named Norman Kitson, who heads up to Pembina. We talked a little bit about Pembina previously. That is the Métis settlement that is basically on the border between the United States territory and Canada. So he's basically sent in Pembina to rally the troops, organize the trade in Pembina to make it basically more profitable for folks like Henry Sibley. And in the 1850 territorial census, there were 1,000 residents in Pembina. And Kitson, who by this point his population his popularity had grown quite a bit, became known as the King of the Border. And there's this really romantic scene of Kitson traveling up to Pembina on a steamboat. He has his arms outstretched at the head of the steamboat, and behind him, Henry Sibley wraps him in a warm embrace. And that's when he proclaimed himself, "I'm the King of the Border." And then Whitney Houston.
And then Celine Dion.
Yeah. Oh, that was Celine Dion? Oh, no.
Yeah, near, far. Yeah. That's Celine Dion.
Viewers, if you would believe it, sometimes my pop culture references are a little off because I spend so much time reading and making jokes about long dead land speculators like Norman Kitson and Henry Hastings Sibley. So I don't know a singer from the 90s. Little blind spot there of mine.
It's okay.
So Logan, what happens with Pembina and the folks, the Métis community on the border there?
Yeah, well, we've talked about Pembina before, like you said, and the Métis community there, remember, is this really, really fascinating community of mixed race individuals who have formed this totally independent culture. Wingerd points out that they call themselves the Jeunes Libres, or the free people. Kind of people without a government, people who, like you said, go back and forth between Canada and the United States at will, and who get into trouble in both places as well. Remember, we started out talking about Buffalo in this episode, and that's part of why it was profitable to head up there, is that, it went up. Pembina is not only north, it's also to the west. It's in the northwestern most stretch of the Minnesota region, and it provided a great opportunity for buffalo hunting and satisfying that high demand for hide demand.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's right. But This is one of the ways that men like Henry Sidley try to take some small, nice things from the dying fur trade. As he says in 1847, Wingerd quotes him on 164, "It needs no prophet to foresee that things in this country are now in a transit state, and that the fur trade must ere long be brought to a close. What I shall do then, if my life be spared, remains to be seen. Perhaps I may turn politician or office seeker, or apply myself to some equally mean occupation." One of those mean occupations in the 1840s was one that Henry Rice took up very enthusiastically, which was removing Indians. It's one great test example is the removal of the Winnebago or Ho-Chunk tribe from Wisconsin into Minnesota territory, or in Iowa, and then eventually into Minnesota. In 1847, Henry Rice brought them from Iowa into Minnesota.
Right, but I thought you just said you wanted to remove the Indians. So why is he bringing them into Minnesota?
Yeah, there's an interesting paradox or contradiction at the center of the Indian policy of the whites in Minnesota at this time, and it's that there is this focus on being in charge of the control of Indians and moving them around, removing them from their ancestral lands, and this language of the Indian threat constantly, and that's justification for a lot of the removal. But you'll find instances like this with the Ho-Chunk where they're not removed away from the whites in Minnesota; they're brought into Minnesota for annuity payments, like we talked about earlier. More Indians coming into your region means more opportunities for treaties, more opportunities for those annuity payments that are an inflow of cash, and an opportunity to exploit the Indians, to get that money off of their hands by any means possible.
Right.
And that's the role of these removal policies.
Right. So we talked about the Ojibwe a little earlier, and how they really were trying to advocate for themselves. So, they knew that settlement was coming. They knew that profiteers were coming, and they just wanted to make sure that they were compensated for this land that basically they could no longer live on the way that they used to. And a lot of people were aware of this changing world. The Métis were an example of that, of sort of people who understood the indigenous culture, but tried to transition and keep up with the world. It wasn't just sort of this stonewalling, which wasn't a phrase back then, this stonewalling of the changing world. There was this active attempt to stay a part of the world and to stay basically competitive with the changes that were going on. And one of those people who exemplifies that is Little Crow. And Little Crow's a name that's come up quite a bit. But in 1845, a big transition took place. Big Thunder, Little Crow III, died, and his son, Tayateduta, basically took on the mantle, the leader of the Kaposia band of the Mdewakanton, and then he also took on the name Little Crow. And part of what basically his father's dying wish was to make peace with the whites and to assimilate, really, is to take on some of the characteristics of the white culture that was taking place in Minnesota in order to keep peace, in order to keep the Kaposia band alive. So Tayateduta, Little Crow, he traded alcohol. He took on basically what the white settlers were doing. And many Native Americans, many Dakota were involved in this, including Native women who were just as involved as everything else. But the difference between how white settlers used capitalism for their own personal wealth, their own personal investments, what the Dakota were doing at this time when they were going into commercial enterprises, they used the wealth that they gained, like any other resource in their culture, to sustain the collective, to sustain their entire tribe, their entire network of kinship relationships. And for that reason, and largely probably because they were just taking up some of the space in the market, the white entrepreneurs of the time didn't like that. And I want to just read this quote here from Wingerd on page 172, quote, "The white traders, dismayed at this reversal of roles," that is the Indian being the whiskey seller, tried to patrol the rivers to stop the unlicensed Indian traders, and even enlisted the military to halt a growing competition. But nothing could stop the Indian entrepreneurs, who knew the terrain far better than any pursuer, end quote. So kind of, we're in this weird, like you said, this time of transition in the North Country. And this is part of why it's so difficult to talk about Minnesota history, because what's true in one decade, in 1 year, is going to be totally different than in another. So it's very difficult in a 6th grade history textbook to sum up these hundreds of years of history without leaving out a really vital part of the story. And that's partially because of these sort of bizarre changes that happen year to year, decade to decade, as the land and the relationship between and within and without change over these many years.
Yeah, I think we've used some variation of the phrase "a time of transition" in maybe every episode.
Yeah.
Because it's constantly changing, and like you talked about, the economic actions of Native people in Minnesota at this time reflects that. There's this idea that's out there a lot, that there's just something like, almost like the whites and the Indians, the eventual fate of Minnesota was decided by unbreakable racial characteristics. And they're not framed as racial characteristics all the time, but that's really what they are. When the idea is that these were two cultures who, there was no way for it to go any other direction than destruction for the Indians and domination on the part of the white settlers.
It was going a different direction for hundreds of years.
There are many different directions for hundreds of years, and even people like Little Crow, who would go on to play a leading role in the U.S. Dakota War of 1862, had at another time, Tauyate-Duta, had at another time, maybe 15 years earlier, as Wingerd writes, had spent time learning arithmetic and English reading, English writing, and learning how to find a point of adaptation where Native culture could exist, could survive alongside this new American settlement and influence. Mm-hmm. It didn't have to go the way that it did go. There's nothing, there's nothing in the DNA of Indians that says that they're fated to eventually lead in a war and be wiped out. There were choices that were made,
and that almost gives too much fault to the indigenous people who do live here. Obviously, it wasn't their decision for new settlers to come. But again, when I talk about they weren't just these stonewalling forces, it's not as though indigenous people were unwilling to adapt and unwilling to work with the settlers that were here, that were unwilling to trade. Very clearly, we've talked about this every episode. There was mutual benefit to trade. There was mutual benefit to living with each other, living with an understanding of each other's cultures and understanding how to coexist in the North Country with each other. And you're right, when we talk about this being basically a foregone conclusion, it takes away so much agency of the thousands of people who lived through this narrative, who survived and made peace throughout the narrative that we've been telling. We're still some 20 years away from the U.S. Dakota War and the point of the story that we're at. There's still coexistence. There is still peace. And so to frame the U.S.-Dakota War as something that is, I would agree that it is vitally important, and it is the founding the founding decision, the founding time frame for the state of Minnesota that we live in today. But it did not have to be. And I think that's what you were getting at, Logan, that framing it as really the quintessential event, and the only quintessential event of the Dakota interacting with the settlers, really doesn't do anyone justice.
Yes, we try to stress every now and then that there are specific choices that people made that led to the type of history that we have. It wasn't. There's a background of forces and long changes and trends over time and centuries, of course, that leads to what we're getting into in the 1840s and then eventually the 50s and 60s. But individual human beings did make decisions that mattered within that time period. And some of those decisions were disastrous, often intentionally. And we're going to start getting into those in detail for sure next week, and starting with the admission of Minnesota as a territory.
That's right.
Into the Union.
Speaking of someone making catastrophic and calamitous decisions, let's talk a little bit more about our old friend Henry Sibley. He is in favor of Minnesota being a territory. So he, Joe Brown, and Henry Rice were the top spokespeople, the top proponents for Minnesota being a statehood, and Minnesota, first of all, being a territory. So, like I said, there's the payoff for the sizzle for all of you fans of the name Minnesota. Here it is. We're starting to be called Minnesota, because right now, Wisconsin was made a state before Minnesota. So Wisconsin territory went away and became Minnesota. They did not include the Fort Snelling, St. Anthony, St. Paul, St. Croix area that would eventually be part of Minnesota State. They did not include that in Wisconsin territory, in Wisconsin State, rather. But Wisconsin territory stopped existing. So except for this little military fort that is Fort Snelling, the rest of Minnesota is no man's land. It's lawless. It doesn't really have a government. And you saw how some of the profiteers behaved when there was government present. Let's see how they do without it. So there's no government present in Minnesota, but they want it to be recognized by the United States Congress. So what do? They decide to lobby for statehood, and they've been doing it for a long time. But basically what you needed was a threshold of 5,000 adult white males to be considered a territory. So they went around or allegedly went around and got people to sign it. And sort of bizarrely, especially we talk about the folks in Pembina, there's a lot of Métis mixed race people living in Minnesota. And depending on the political winds, I think is what Wingerd calls it, they are sometimes considered indigenous. They are sometimes considered white. And in this case, Henry Sibley and everyone was all for them being white, because they needed to boost their numbers to get to that highest population level possible. So Henry Sibley was seen as the face of this Minnesota stagecraft, as Wingerd wrote. And she continues, quote, "But Joe Brown was indisputably the political genius that carried the project forward. Described by a contemporary as one of the shrewdest politicians and most extraordinary men the Northwest has ever produced, Brown was Sibley's chief counselor and manager. The two veterans of the trade had similar interests and investments in Minnesota's future, and Brown, schooled in the hardscrabble dealings of Wisconsin territorial politics, had no compunctions about bending the legalities a bit to advance the cause, which allowed Sibley to ostensibly remain above the fray." So those are our leaders talking about the tactics really that are going to be put into place, and we do have some attempted election going on here, but it seems like Sibley's a real shoo-in. He's really popular. He's got a broad coalition, but just for kicks and giggles, Henry Rice decides to throw his name in the ring, and throw his hat in the ring rather, and puts himself on the ballot. Which no one really gets. Remember, he had kind of an okay alliance with Sibley, depending on when it was expedient. So I'm just going to read this little description of what that Minnesota's first election really was like as Minnesota. The contest that commenced, and this is Wingerd, the contest that commenced was wild and rife with political irony. Neither candidate resided east of the Mississippi, and thus were not even residents of Wisconsin Territory, which itself no longer legally existed. In addition, at least a third of the potential voters were mixed-blood people, whose status as Indian or white shifted with the political winds, like I said before. In the name of political expediency, no one questioned or even commented on the rather glaring irregularities of Minnesota's first electoral campaign, but the politicking itself was considerably less restrained. Supporters on both sides engaged in energetic smear campaigns and unabashed vote buying. On Election Day, they dispensed rivers of whiskey to entice voters' allegiance. While Sibley loftily abjured this bare-knuckle campaigning, Brown carried on the fight on his behalf. When the votes were tallied, Rice had taken St. Anthony Falls. As one candid Sibley supporter regretfully reported, quote, "We should have done better, but they commenced buying votes in the morning," end quote. Elsewhere, Rice was not so fortunate. The brash newcomer proved no match for the combination of Sibley's influence and Brown's political acumen. The final count astoundingly proved Sibley the people's choice, with 236 votes to Rice's 122. Of course, the greatest irony of Minnesota's first electoral contest was one that never crossed voters' minds, that a mere 357 individuals should determine the future of a territory home to more than 30,000 Indian people, end quote. So there is a summary of Minnesota's first election, but ultimately they sent Henry Sibley to Congress as their territorial delegate, lobbying for statehood, which eventually was granted with a little help from Stephen Douglas, who was a prominent politician of the time. He introduced the bill, lobbied strong for Minnesota, and on March 3rd, 1849, Minnesota Territory, with St. Paul as its capital, became an official territory in the United States of America. But as a territory, Logan, they need some leadership. They need someone with real gumption. But most importantly, Logan, they need a Whig.
That's right. And you're not referring to the Whig of the founding generation of this country that might have been worn atop a head. You were talking about...
No, something that would have been made of beaver or buffalo or pemmican even. I don't know.
No. You're talking about a Whig with an H. The ill-fated and short-lived political party of the...
You missed my really great joke there where I put the H at the end.
I heard it. I heard it. Yeah, I heard it.
Oof. Yeesh. Ooh. Tough crowd. No, I got what I deserve there. All right. I want to be quiet for a little bit.
The Whig Party is in one of its very brief periods of control of the federal government when Minnesota Territory comes into being in 1849.
I'm going to correct you real quick there. I believe, and we can check the record on here, it was its only control of the federal government.
I think it was.
I believe they only had the presidency once, but I'm going to quick double check that while we're doing this.
Sure. Yeah. Mr. Zachary Taylor was president. He had actually defeated Lewis Cass, who had been a big Whig in the fur trade for a long time, a personal friend of Sibley. And Sibley and Rice, as Democrats, are crestfallen that their territory is going to come into being under a Whig administration, because it means that those lovely appointments, including the governorship of the new territory, would go to a Whig. And indeed it does. A man named Alexander Ramsey from Pennsylvania, who had been a representative in Congress at the time. Ramsey's an interesting guy. Do you have the Whig news on there, Sam?
Oh, yes. We've got the election results. And CNN can project that only 2 Whigs, William Henry Harrison and Zachary Taylor, were ever elected president on their own.
Right.
Whig presidents John Tyler and Millard Fillmore assumed the presidency through succession. So Whigs have a bad habit of dying. So actually, they're just
is that?
Yeah, Harrison and Taylor.
Wow,
yeah,
that's really interesting. I didn't know that every Whig president elected to office died in office.
Sir.
I guess
there's got to be a joke there.
Not be Whigs. Yeah, I don't know.
There's got to be a joke about Whig and Whigs falling. Like
Whigs falling, something like that. Anyways, Governor this Alexander Ramsey comes from Pennsylvania over to the sparsely populated Minnesota territory, and he talks about seeing a couple, quote, few small log houses, no regular roads, plenty of trees and underbrush, running streams, strolling Indians, and but few human white beings. And these partook of all the characteristics of frontier life, as he puts it, end quote. But he was a quick study. Ramsey was he was fast to learn the state of the territory with an able teacher. Henry Sibley offered his home to the 34-year-old new governor, and the two became really close allies in Minnesota politics for the next 15 years and beyond.
I have more bad news for the Whigs. President Zachary Taylor, who appointed our friend Alexander Ramsey, probably could not endure life in Minnesota. Not just because he was a Whig and they, dropped like flies, but specifically how he dropped like flies. He, according to this source, what is this? Wikipedia. Taylor report on the 4th of July, 1850. Taylor reportedly consumed copious amounts of raw fruit and iced milk while attending holiday celebrations during a fundraising event at the Washington Monument, which was then under construction. But if he can't handle raw fruit, I'm not sure how he's going to handle pemmican. That's a good point. I don't think Taylor's cut out for pemmican. So someone should tell him to stay out of Minnesota territory until they get some stoves.
We'll pass the message along to him.
Thank you.
As Ramsey Taylor's beautiful little appointee to Minnesota.
Actually, I believe
is learning.
We had a nickname for Ramsey. I think we had a nickname for Ramsey.
Well, you're right.
Yeah, Bluff Alec. Is that right?
That's correct. And,
okay, you were silent there.
Sam and I spent some time trying to figure out what that name could have possibly meant. There's two definitions of Wingerd doesn't explain it in here.
Is it worth the ink?
Yeah. That's a good question. It's either a reference to Ramsey's size.
I didn't interpret it that way. There might be just a funny story. Like maybe he and his friends were just palling around like a bluff on a riverside. There could be a lot of innocent things, but mostly based on his time in Minnesota, the 34-year-old likely was known for bluffing, assuming responsibilities greater than he was really prepared for. But seemingly able to follow through and win the hand, as it were, win the pot through his bluff. So that's where we get Bluff Alec. And like you said, he was taken under the wing of Henry Sibley, which is actually, when you're looking for profiteering and political advancement in Minnesota, Henry Sibley is a good person to have on your side. He stayed in Sibley's home. He became acquainted, and very quickly he understood that statehood was very important, but so was this sort of precarious situation with the Indians, like you pointed out. On the one hand, you want them gone in the long term, but on the other hand, you want them here for now to get those annuity payments. Have we gotten into this? One of his first acts was trying to get some of the Ojibways back into Minnesota. We talked about that earlier in the episode. But he really hit a snag with the Dakota because there was one Dakota land cession already, but that was only with one band of the Dakota Party. That was with the Midewakanton. The rest of the Dakota land, I believe, what was it?
166,000
166,000 square miles. Excuse you.
Square miles.
Is that what an acre is?
Yeah, no.
I don't know. Okay.
I don't know.
Great. Like we said, we have some blind spots. We know a lot about Minnesota history, but there are a few things, like the practical knowledge of what an acre is and who sings the song in Titanic. So, I think you can give us some grace there, listeners.
That's right.
But largely, the rest of the Dakota did not want to give up their land. And also, they weren't getting annuity payments. And that was a big problem because Ramsey, as you mentioned in that quote, didn't necessarily view the Dakota, the Indians, as human. And probably more importantly, didn't view them as economically useful, especially if they were turning a profit, either selling whiskey or maintaining themselves off the land, or just preventing people from settling and making money that could then be taxed or at least profited off of in Minnesota territory and eventually the Minnesota state. So the conclusion was, in one way or another, the Indians have to go, and that is what he said in his address to the Minnesota territorial legislature. Logan, do you want to read us some of his address from September 4th, 1849?
Yeah, he walks through his plans for the new Minnesota territory, and it really shows off his really quick ability to pick up the main priorities of the white settlers of the state. He talks about the need for federal money to build roads and establish regular mail service.
It's infrastructure week in Minnesota territory.
That's right. Wingerd goes on to write about his call for a stringent law restricting the sale of alcohol to the Indians. The Ojibways, he said, must be removed from the ceded lands, but his overriding priority, Wingerd writes, was acquisition of what was called the Sioux land, the land of the Dakota that, quoting Ramsey now, extensive, rich, and salubrious region, equal in soil to any portion of the valley of the Mississippi, and in healthfulness probably superior to any part of the American continent, rich in minerals, watered by the finest rivers, bespangled with lakes in every direction, wooded hilltops, luxuriant natural meadows, and abundance of the purest water. End quote from Ramsey. Wingerd goes on to write, Ramsey ended his stirring speech with a pledge to, quote, do right, to do justice, to live in harmony with all, and to use whatever power I incidentally possess entirely for the true and abiding well of Minnesota, end quote. Wingerd says, the legislators must have risen in a body to cheer the governor's inspiring address. His words were clearly heartfelt and without intended irony. Despite the fact that Indians were centrally important to the territory's economy, that they owned about 9/10 of the land, and that more than 85% of the territory's population were Ojibwe, Dakota, or Winnebago people, their interest did not factor into the true and abiding well of the territory that Ramsey pledged to serve in justice and harmony. Quite simply, Indians were no part of the future Minnesota he imagined.